We are going to go ahead and get started. My name is Alex Shammy with Namely. Thank you all for joining. We've got people all across the US from SF to Pennsylvania and everywhere in between. So a nice mix of the audience today. Today's webinar is how to close your company's pay gap. It's part of NCHRA's Financial Wellness Series. Today's session will be recorded and distributed after the webinar. So if there's something you miss or we're going a little too quick, don't worry, we'll make sure that you get the recording and the slides after the fact. Moving right along, a couple of housekeeping items before we jump into the content. My name is Alex, as I mentioned, with Namely. Namely is an HR platform, and we do live events all across the country. This week, we are in Philadelphia. They're usually pretty nicely sized events, good for networking. I believe we'll have pizza and beverages, and there's always good content. So Matthew from Harrisburg, I don't know how big of a drive that is down to Philadelphia, but we'll be in Philadelphia tomorrow night talking about benefits all across the employee life cycle. Tomorrow, we're down in Atlanta, Georgia, talking, I believe, with Okta about building a culture that embraces security. And next week, we are up in the Northeast talking about employee engagement in Boston, Massachusetts. So if you don't have the time to type in those URLs, like I said, we'll distribute them after the fact, and you can go ahead and register. They're really good places to meet other HR practitioners in your area. Additionally, an event not listed here is HR Tech next month. I believe Namely will have a booth, and NCHRA will be there as well. So be sure, if you're headed to that event, to come out and meet the Namely teams. Additionally, as you're on this webinar, we do a lot of live webinars that are educational content from thought leaders in HR. Our next webinar is with Think Human in Square Foot, a commercial real estate company based in New York, where we're talking about the secrets of retaining your high performers. We'll include a registration link to this one as in the same email that we send out the recording. So without further ado, I know that's a couple minutes worth of housekeeping there, but hopefully you're able to come meet us. We will jump right into the agenda. So today's topic is really fascinating. Namely, we get a lot of data on pay equity and the pay gap. So today we're going to talk about the history of the gender wage gap. Where we are today, there's a lot of legislation and things happening around the current state of the wage gap. We'll dive into what causes this, why this is a current issue in today's workplace, and then we'll introduce pay equity, how you can solve this problem in the workplace. And then I think it's helpful to look back and see what we can do to rectify an issue, but mitigating it is important so that you're proactive in your approach. So we'll talk about how to alleviate the pay gap, jump into a Q&A session, and then we'll distribute a SHRM and HRCI code. This session is available for 1 credit in each of those. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce today Namely's very own speaker, Deborah Squires. As Namely's Chief Client Officer, Deborah is the voice of the client throughout Namely. She infuses the client perspective in all decisions, processes, and strategies, works across Namely. I know everyone recognizes her smiling face here. She's a fan favorite, you could say, in the office, in any of our offices. She works across Namely to ensure a holistic client experience and accelerate growth by driving a highly engaged client base through advocacy and brand loyalty initiatives. She joined Namely in 2015, has over 25 years of experience in senior leadership roles in HR, ranging from HR leadership, consulting, outsourcing, client services, and success. You name it, Deborah's done it. She's an expert in pay equity. She knows this like the back of her hand. And her deepest passion in HR are leadership, engagement and culture, and talent development. So super, super thrilled to introduce Deborah. Thank you for joining today.
Thanks so much for that great introduction, Alex. I really appreciate it. And I'm truly excited to have this conversation with a wide audience here on the gender wage gap. In addition to what Alex introduced, I am also the executive sponsor for Namely's Dive In Committee, which is our diversity and inclusion initiatives. So equality is a topic very near and dear to my heart. And in fact, the gender wage gap is one of the most pressing issues in the workplace today. It's not just an issue of regulatory requirement, it's an issue of fairness and employee engagement in the workplace. Across all industries, our research shows that women continue to make less than their male colleagues in the same roles. Because of your influence over employee compensation, it's often said that HR professionals are best equipped to close the gap. After all, you do initiate the conversations, provide oversight and input on practices, and you develop and oversee the frameworks that can close the existing gaps and ensure equity in pay moving forward. We know you can't do it alone, though. It takes leadership commitment. So in our presentation today, we're going to review the facts and provide you with practical guidance to take back to your leadership team and companies so that you can gain that really critical support to addressing this really important issue. So let's begin the conversation by touching on the history of the wage gap. It was back in 1963 when President Kennedy signed the Equal Pay Act, making it illegal to pay women at a lower rate for performing the same job as men in the US. That was 55 years ago. I will venture to guess that most of us on this call weren't even born quite yet. So it's been around a while. That said, the law, as you know, places the burden of proof on the employees subject to the pay disparity, and we know that's a difficult burden to prove. Many employers unlawfully forbid or ultimately discourage workers from discussing wages, so discovering pay disparities in the first place is half the battle for employees. That places the burden on us as leaders, as HR practitioners, to continue to drive the change that will get us to the state of equality. So fast forward to 2017, again, 55 years later, and you'll see, sadly, that the gender pay gap has essentially remained the same. Current estimates indicate it will take us nearly 100 years since the passage to close the gender pay gap. Now, I don't know about you, but I really feel strongly that we can do better than that. So I'm excited to talk to you about what we can do to solve that problem. Let's talk about the current state of the wage gap. But before we do that, I want to dive in to the data, and we want to poll you on the effect of the wage gap. Please take a moment to respond to the poll on the current state of the gap. Have you ever heard of someone directly being paid less than a peer of another gender in the same role? Yes or no? All right. 73% of you said you did, or you have at least once heard of someone being paid less than a peer of another gender in the same role. I'm actually surprised that it's such a low response on the no's, that 28% of you haven't experienced that. And that's actually encouraging and inspiring to me, that it seems to have not permeated all of your experiences. So let's move forward. We're going to be sharing a lot of data here. And the data comes from our partner Hired, who conducts a state of wage inequality report study and delivers a report every year. And recently, Namely released a diversity and inclusion report back in June of this year. So a lot of the data that we're going to share comes from those two reports, which we're happy to provide access to as well. So in this year's report, Hired found that 54% of women reported that they had found out that they were paid less than a peer of another gender in the same role. Only 19% of men reported the same experience throughout their careers. This may explain why 21% more women than men believe gender identity affects salary. Hired found that 63% of the time, men are offered higher salaries than women for the same role at the same company. These numbers haven't budged since Hired's 2017 report, which is quite disheartening and discouraging. It's also important to note that wage inequality goes beyond gender. Factors such as race and age can all affect salaries and expectations, which we'll cover further in the presentation. I mentioned earlier this year, Namely released a diversity report highlighting the state of diversity and inclusion at over 1,000 mid-sized companies covering nearly 200,000 employees. We found that the leadership gap is real. Of the 41,000 managers that we polled, only 35% are women. Managers and direct reports are closely aligned by gender, and we believe that does have an impact on the outcomes here. Males report to males 78% of the time, where females report to females only 51% of the time. Only 21% of men report to women. Similar to me bias has an impact on compensation, performance, and promotion decisions. So solving for the disparities in diversity and inclusion will be critical to closing the gender wage gap. So the big number, 80% of women in the US are typically paid 80% of what men are paid for the same role, a gap of 20%. The National Women's Law Center estimates that women lose out on over $400,000 in salary over the course of their career lifetime due to the wage gap, with this figure soaring to over 500,000 in some states. That is a phenomenal number and a huge impact. At its current pace, the pay gap won't neutralize until 2059, nearly 100 years after the Equal Pay Act was passed. Though slow, the narrowing gap does leave room to hope that female candidates are entering the workforce with a heightened awareness of potential bias. And definitely given the developments over the last year with Me Too and Time's Up movements bringing to the forefront a number of inequalities and bad behaviors, the environment is primed for us to finally close the gender wage gap and level the playing field once and for all. As mentioned previously, additional factors beyond gender come into play. So let's take a look at age first. Female candidates between 20 and 25 make 97 cents for every dollar men in similar roles earn. By the time they're in their 40s, though, this gap increases to 90 cents. Why the dramatic shift? We believe that the delayed gap reflects a return to the workforce by women who have taken time off to start a family. There are also issues beyond compensation that are impacted by women taking time off to start their families, with one Harvard study finding that returning mothers were 6 times less likely to be hired. So there's an opportunity gap there as well. Other factors also contribute. As the salary gaps begin, basing offers on prior salary exacerbates the gap over time. Imposter syndrome among women is common the further they move up in their careers. We often undervalue our own abilities, and we use different negotiation tactics. Similar to me bias, which I mentioned earlier, does come into play. So if you report to a manager of a different gender, that can also have an impact. And in Namely's diversity report, we found that only 31% of women report to other women, where 54% of promotions and 57% of raises go to men. It's not surprising given that men are the slight majority in the workforce. However, what was startling is that we found that both women and men award raises to direct reports of the same gender nearly twice as often. That's pretty astounding. Now let's tackle how race impacts the gender pay gap. Black women working full-time year-round typically make only 63 cents for every dollar paid to their white, non-Hispanic male counterparts. You can see for Latinas, this figure is only 54 cents, and for Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander women, it's 59 cents. While Asian working women full-time year-round are typically paid at only 87 cents for every dollar paid to their white, non-Hispanic male counterparts, the wage gap is substantially larger for some subgroups of Asian women. So the wage gap translates into an annual loss of almost $22,000 annually for Black women, over $26,000 annually for Latinas, $24,000 for Native women, and about $7,300 for Asian women. According to Namely's diversity report, nearly 20% of white employees manage someone, while Black and Hispanic employees are managers only half as often. So I continue to emphasize the impact of not having diversity on individual teams has on increasing that wage gap. So what are the causes? Well, first, women simply are asking for less than their counterparts. The Hired survey and what was reported in their most recent report found that women are asking for less money 66% of the time. I'm going to let that marinate for a minute. We're not asking for the same amount as our male counterparts on a consistent basis. And we are asking for 6% less on average. Now think about the impact of that over the course of a career of 20 or 30 years. That definitely adds up. Undervaluing our accomplishments may be one reason women don't ask for what they're worth. 50% of the time, female survey respondents said they frequently experience imposter syndrome. It's a real challenge for us. Women are also overrepresented in low-wage workforce roles. Women make up nearly 6 in 10 workers in low-wage jobs that typically pay less than $11 per hour, and 7 in 10 of those are the lowest wage jobs, those that typically pay less than $10 an hour. Women disproportionately hold low-wage jobs like childcare workers, home health aides, and fast food workers. According to Namely's diversity report, females are in the majority in HR departments, marketing departments, and finance departments, where males make up the majority in engineering, sales, and operations. Sales and marketing are also predominantly white at almost 70% of the workforce in those fields. And Black colleagues are underrepresented in nearly every single department except operations. There's a tremendous opportunity gap that we have the opportunity to close. Now that we hopefully at this point all agree that the wage gap is still in fact very real and a major issue, let's cover what we can do to continue overcoming and closing that wage gap. So pay equity is the means of paying employees fairly and consistently without discrimination on the basis of gender, race, or other protected categories, but taking into account job-related factors such as education, work experience, and tenure. It certainly doesn't mean that everybody in the same role is paid the same amount, but there are objective factors that drive compensation within the range for specific roles and role levels. Keep in mind, discrimination is not always overt. Unconscious bias and similar to me bias influence outcomes. So given the disparity and diversity in leadership and in many departments, it's clearly had an impact on our current state. Solving the diversity and inclusion gaps will also move us to a more equitable pay environment. Why is pay equity important? Well, first and foremost, it is the law. So you can face significant challenges if you don't have equitable pay. But more importantly, having a fair workplace and providing equal opportunity is good for business. It gives you a competitive advantage. In Hired study, over 75% of candidates indicated their interest in working for an organization that is known to have a positive work environment and have fair employment practices. So the salary history ban has become a hot topic in the HR space more recently than ever. The theory here is that using salary history to determine future compensation further perpetuates the issue. That's how you end up in situations where $400,000 or $500,000 over the career lifetime of an individual is impacted by the wage gap. So what's the solution? Well, many states believe that banning the use of the salary history in interviewing and compensation discussions is a key. So ultimately, if we're not using past disparities to determine wages, but we're actually hiring to the wage range for the position based on that, it will close the gap. This does help, but it's also important that we have independent oversight of employment offers and develop women in their salary negotiation skills. We saw earlier that 66% of women don't ask as much as men do for the same role, and that gap is typically around 6%. So there's an opportunity for us to further educate and cultivate the skills for women in negotiation. So Massachusetts was the first state to pass the ban in 2016. And since then, California, Oregon, Delaware, and a slew of other states and cities have followed suit. So how can we close the gap? We talked about the salary ban, but there are a number of steps that we can take as HR leaders in our organizations or as leaders in our organizations. You don't have to be in HR to have an impact here. So we recommend establishing a compensation philosophy and creating a compensation structure for all positions, collecting and looking at the data for your existing employees and taking appropriate actions based on your findings, being transparent and communicating your results and your commitment widely, and recruiting, focusing on recruiting compliance. Ask for salary expectations, or better yet, promote the actual pay range or share the actual pay range rather than focusing on salary history and perpetuating that gap. So we recommend, from a compensation philosophy perspective, that really becomes your guiding factor. It's your true north in making decisions and creating your structure. We strongly encourage you to benchmark your compensation with market factors and data. So look at factors such as company size, growth stage, location, industry, and the competition for talent in your market. You can benchmark your salaries relative to the market rate and create ranges for each job. It's imperative to apply a set standard across every job role, but you don't have to create a complicated job grade system in order for this to be effective. Market-based ranges by position are satisfactory in most mid-sized companies. HR also has all the information on what's important during the interview process. So looking at the selection process and determining among your existing employees, are employees leaving for higher salary or more growth opportunities? Look at that exit interview feedback. And then also look at offers that have been declined. Are they more or less prevalent among certain departments or certain positions? We strongly encourage independent review for equity and alignment to the compensation philosophy and guidelines in the selection process. So ensure that we don't perpetuate bad practices by having independent review there. Also, take the time to develop an employee value proposition and use that in your hiring and retention and motivation efforts. Understand how your compensation affects your attractiveness as an employer, and how you reward your employees really can have an impact on their commitment, motivation, and engagement over time. It will help you differentiate yourself from your competitors. Think in terms of the growth opportunities that you offer. If you're a rapidly growing company, you may have rapid opportunity for growth. If you're an established organization, you may have stronger training programs that provide people with the opportunity to enhance their skills in new ways. Some companies are able to justify paying just below market if they have better brand recognition or long-term value to an individual's career path. Take a holistic view of compensation. Think in terms of total rewards, not just cash or base compensation. Salary shouldn't be the only component of your company's overall compensation philosophy. So take into account additional factors like variable compensation, equity, benefits, PTO, catered lunches, and other perks. For companies that aren't able to compete so much on salary, this is an area to keep talent happy. That environment has a huge impact on engagement. Also, be transparent. I'm certainly not recommending that you publish wages for all of your employees. I know some companies have gone that route. But once you've created a compensation philosophy and structure, it's important to be transparent about that. Communicate the philosophy widely across the organization, and use the opportunity to generate that positive internal public relations as it relates to your commitment to your employees' overall rewards. Lastly, you want to be sure to review your compensation periodically to ensure that you're staying in line with the market. You should consider your own company's life cycle. Are you in a high growth or hiring rapidly situation, or are you more stable or mature? Is there a lot of competition for talent in your particular geographic area or in your industry? Some companies may need to review their compensation structure and practices every 6 months, where other companies may be just fine looking at it annually or biannually. There's no one size fits all as far as timing goes. So in collecting and looking at the data, technology has really made it possible for HR teams to more easily identify pay disparities. Analytics tools have made it possible for you to readily report on salaries and promotions by gender, ethnicity, department, location, a number of factors. So let's take a quick poll. Is your team currently conducting equal pay audits? Apologies. So we'll take a minute and then we'll see what your responses were. Okay, so 22% of you are conducting simple pay audits using gender and ethnic information. 6% of you, 4 respondents, are conducting advanced pay audits with a data analyst. That's exciting. Another 41% of you are considering implementing equal pay audits and plan to implement the audits in the near future. And then another 31% of you are have not considered that. Okay, great. So for a good number of you, this will be a good topic to hit on. So what are the variables to consider when you're collecting and looking at the data for your existing employees? You want to evaluate compensation practices regularly, but the pace should be informed by your company's industry, talent market dynamics, and growth pace, as I mentioned earlier. Companies with trained data analysts should at least be running basic descriptive statistics. For example, mean and median salaries at every job level split by gender and ethnicity. Small companies may only have a sample size to run robust gender equality analysis, while larger companies should be able to run ethnic equity analyses as well. You need to make sure that you have a statistically significant group in order to determine which might be most appropriate for your company. When conducting a pay equity audit, job level is the most important variable to consider first. So job level is really going to impact salary. And for example, if more men exist in management without accounting for job level, other positions that would be at relatively the same level, you may misinterpret salary inequities as being due to gender when they are in fact really due to job level and promotion issues. So it's really important to step back and take a look at that at job level. Another factor to drill down on is job performance, since we expect performance to meaningfully impact salary over time. Really critical to evaluate performance ratings against raises that are provided against where people are at in your salary ranges. If you see patterns of inequity between genders when accounting for both level and performance, you may want to consider how to address those gaps. There are a number of ways that you can do so. The raw data for this kind of analysis can be pulled from your HRIS, namely provides a nice diversity dashboard as well as a salary history report. So most modern HRIS systems will provide you with an analytics tool that will help you get to the data that you need to conduct the analysis. Obviously, the analysis occurs outside of your HRIS because you're breaking it down for various factors that are relevant to your business. So we mentioned communicating the results widely. Again, we're not suggesting that that you share your salary levels across all of your company or do anything along those lines. But we do believe that it's really critical to communicate consistently what your focus is and what your philosophy is from a compensation perspective, what your practices are when you're conducting merit reviews, for example, and how those work, and truly training your managers to have those conversations. You'll want to use really robust reporting and visuals for employees to understand where they stand individually. So in those merit conversations or in manager one-on-ones with employees, you'll want to make sure that those managers are empowered to have really meaningful conversations with regard to where someone is at within their range, what their opportunity for growth is in their current role, what future opportunities may be available to them based on their skill set and desires and opportunities at the company, and then how the employee can progress into those roles or progress along the salary range for their own position. So many states now make it illegal for you to ask about salary history. One recommendation that we offer is to ask for salary expectations right up front, early in the recruiting process. I also feel strongly that, as the employer, you typically are in the position of power to have access to more information than the.
Colin, this is Edna. I have to tell you, this thing with names is turning out to be a little bit of a disaster. In that.
Hey guys, looks like we're having some technical difficulties. Give us 30 seconds to figure out what's going on, and we'll be right back.
Okay, apologies for that. This is Deborah. If you could just comment if you can hear me again. Okay, perfect. So sorry about that. Gotta love technology sometimes, right? Okay, so let's pick back up on recruiting compliance. I was mentioning that many states or several states have already banned the use of salary history. So a couple of ways to deal with that is to ask for expectations up front early in the recruitment process. What you can do is ask for the candidate's salary expectations, or more importantly, I actually believe that you're in a position as the hiring company to just candidly state what the range is or the potential of the position and ask if this is aligned with what the employee or the candidate is seeking. You don't give up any power in the process, and you actually will have a much more efficient process by being candid and transparent up front. Also, make sure that you don't release current or former employee compensation to a third party without their consent, so that you don't contribute to that pay disparity perpetuating over time as they're pursuing other opportunities. So to recap, focusing on pay equity is not only required by law, but it's also beneficial to the overall success of your company. From an employer branding perspective, a good reputation expands access to top talent, and a good reputation increases the likelihood of your offer being accepted because people want to work for companies that treat people fairly. If you've been hiring in the last few years, then you know that the prevalence of Glassdoor and other online review systems will either generate a positive momentum for your recruiting initiatives and the talent that you have access to, or it will require that you answer a lot of difficult questions in the hiring process. So it's a good investment. Also, it is the law, so it's important that, as HR practitioners and leaders in our company, that we're taking the initiative to truly impact pay equity according to the Equal Pay Act that was passed back in the 60s. Finally, if there's no better reason to do it, studies show that companies who are diverse and have equitable employment practices, including equitable pay, have much better business results. A study of over 22,000 international companies found that those with at least 30% female representation at the executive level reported 6% higher profits than those without. Workplaces that place special emphasis on diversity and inclusion throughout the company also repeatedly reported improved financial results. So there's good value to the business in doing the right thing.
All right. Thank you, Deborah. That was fantastic. A lot of interesting comments and questions that we'll get to in just a moment. As Deborah mentioned, she and I are both from Namely. Namely is an all-in-one HR, payroll, and benefits platform created to help mid-sized companies build a better workplace. All sorts of really cool analytics on pay equity in the Namely dashboard. So feel free to reach out to check it out at the conclusion of this webinar. So with that, I'll jump into a couple questions that came in that we'll ask Deborah before concluding this webinar. And reminder, this session is recorded, and after we do Q&A, there will be a SHRM certification code that will be cut off from the recording. So make sure you stick on for a couple minutes while we do Q&A to get that code. So I'll start from an interesting question that I saw. This one, Deborah reads, I'm not in HR, but I'm aware that there's a gender gap issue in my company. How would you suggest building a case to our executive team?
Great question. So I just want to emphasize that we all have the opportunity to impact change in our companies, regardless of department or role level. I think starting with the facts is the best way to build your case. One, it generates better results for the business when you have equitable pay practices and a strong commitment to diversity and inclusion. So use some of the data that we provided in this presentation to raise awareness that there is a problem globally, and identify the business impact that addressing that problem can have. And then I would work as a partner with your HR team and leadership to identify what steps can be taken, what policies, programs can be put in place to begin to close that gap. Definitely leverage your HR leadership to support you with the fact finding that will be necessary to make that case and to help affect change. And then I would also say, if you're a people manager, keep in mind that not all discrimination is intentional. Unconscious bias factors in, and similar to me bias definitely is proven to have a consistent impact in the workplace. So make sure that you are promoting a diverse group of employees on your team. Make sure that your talent pipeline is robust, and that you're selecting the best qualified candidate, but that you have diversity in the talent pipeline, and you're ensuring that you have diversity on your team. So hopefully that helps.
Great. An interesting one that actually just rolled in. Deborah, I'll ask you this. Should pay audits be completed under attorney-client privilege?
So it's definitely a good idea to invoke privilege by leveraging your either in-house counsel or external counsel in the process of evaluating and considering those alternatives.
And another one that I think is a really relevant one is, how do we help educate women on how to negotiate salaries to help close the gap?
Yeah, so that's a great question. There are a number of organizations that are actually putting out webinars and training programs to develop women to take on both that conversation as well as advocating for themselves in their career growth and development. So one organization that I'm familiar with, based out of New York, but that has a nationwide or perhaps even international network, is the Forte Foundation out of New York. They have online programs and webinars that are free or low cost that will help with that training. So it's not something that you necessarily have to come up with yourself. Negotiation skills are a general skill set, and you can definitely access either e-learning or in-person training for that as well. The challenge that women face, though, is the additional impact of factors like the imposter syndrome and gaps sometimes in work history that are harder to explain or harder to overcome. So I strongly encourage you to look for programs like those that the Forte Foundation puts on that specifically focus on women's negotiation skills as it relates to their careers and their salaries.
All right, and I see a lot of comments on asking you to repeat the name of the company.
Oh, it's the Forte Foundation, F-O-R-T-E Foundation. So it's actually a nonprofit. Another one that you could consider is the Athena Alliance, which is specifically focused on getting more female representation at the board level, but they have programs to develop women and coach women over time.
Great. So moving right along, and I think you touched on this at the end, Deborah, but a question that I see is, what approach would you take in sharing wage data publicly within an organization? We currently do not have a company-wide dashboard.
Got it. So I would first off, I would be mindful as to how much you can feasibly share and manage internally. So I'm a proponent of employees understanding what the salary range is for their position and how they can move up in the salary range, what they need to do from a performance or results perspective to accomplish that. I would do that more in individual meetings because each individual employee's situation is very different, instead of just posting salary ranges and speaking generally. Now, once you do it with one-on-one with employees, the salary ranges will be out there. So I don't discourage sharing salary ranges, but I wouldn't do that until you have a well-trained management group, because the reality is you're going to be signing up for a long line outside your office or at your desk if you don't empower your managers to have those meaningful conversations, not only about compensation and where someone sits within the range, why they're there and what they need to do to move up in the range, but also how to grow and develop their employees and really work with employees on their development planning so that they can achieve all of their career ambitions.
All right. So a couple more, one or two more we'll take. So if you've got questions, let them come in. The next question I'll ask is, as our company pays all employees at each level the same salary without exception, we do not have a wage gap issue. However, we do seem to have a problem with men being promoted faster than women who entered the company at the same time. Any recommendations on combating this issue?
Very interesting. So a couple of thoughts with regard to that. I would take a step back and look at what's going on from a performance perspective. And I would actually assemble a team of individuals, not just the managers and the departments that are impacted, but actually kind of a broader brush approach to looking at what's going on from a rating and performance perspective. One of the things that we see happen in companies with who are conducting performance reviews and basing promotions on at least partially results in those performance reviews is, if you don't have a calibration in place where you're level setting across managers, you have varying degrees of criticality in reviews as they're assessing what meets expectations versus exceeds expectations. I'm sure we've all worked for people, for managers who don't believe in giving somebody the highest rating on a performance review because there's always room for improvement. And then there are others who are generous with giving people the highest rating on performance reviews. The reality is, though, from manager to manager, that's different. And if that's happening across your company, you need some method to calibrate across managers so that people in one department aren't penalized by a stricter view or perspective on ratings than people in another department. And that can contribute to it as well. Then I would look at what kinds of development plans you have in place, what kinds of training programs and what budget you've set aside to develop people, and ensure that those dollars are being invested in an equitable manner. Just like women tend to ask for less from a compensation perspective, they may also tend to ask for less from a development and growth perspective. So let's make sure that you're encouraging your managers to invest equitably in their employees and give everybody that opportunity to close the gap on where they are today and where they'd like to be in their career, whether it's in the same role at a higher compensation or it's another level in the organization. Hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, definitely. So just want to give you a shout out. Thank you, Deborah, for taking questions. I'm going to do one more before we sign off here, or leave the SHRM certification code up. But the last question I see is, and this came up a couple times in the Q&A, in regards to recruiting compliance, what would you say is the best way to determine their salary level without outright asking? My team wants to ensure the expectations are within the same range.
Yeah, got it. So I'm actually going to append your question with another question that I see that's in the chat box, not in Q&A. So as it relates to salary history, our recommendation and what we're seeing many companies do in response to the varying state requirements is to have a company policy across the board, regardless of which state you're hiring or the candidate is in, to not ask salary history questions. Salary history has proven to perpetuate the wage inequities between females and males. So not using salary history across the board is really important to closing the wage gap, even though it's not required in certain states, or it's not prohibited, in certain states. My recommendation is that in the recruiting process, in the initial phases of the recruiting process, you have your recruiters evaluate the candidate for fit and interest and skill set, and then have the recruiters close out the conversation with the salary conversation initiated by the recruiter. Our hiring range is X to Y, or our OTE is X to Y. Does this fit in with your expectations? I know that in the past, we've played this game in the recruitment process where, we don't want to be the first one to convey a salary number. But the reality is we have a budget, and we have a budget that we hire within. And it's important that we not take somebody through the process for their sake and for your hiring team's sake, including hiring managers and peers that participate in that process, if there's not a fit. So there's no power loss in being candid and transparent. In fact, you may earn some points for doing so early in the process.
All right. Thanks for tapping into the chat there, Deborah. I think that's all that I see come through. So a big shout out to you. Thank you so much. Some fantastic content. We're going to send around the recording. Really great feedback we saw throughout the course of the webinar. So thank you, Deborah. I think we all appreciated it. And now we're going to move forward to the SHRM certification code, which you should see on your screen. And I think we had blocked till 3 p.m. Eastern, but finished a little early, so a couple minutes back to your day. We'll leave this up for a few minutes while we sign off. But thank you all for joining, and we'll see you next time.